Welcome everyone to episode 7 of Arab Identity. I have with me Dr. Professor Ronald Stockton, Professor of Political Science from the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being with us in this episode. Professor Stockton has a podcast called Stockton After Class Podcast. You'll find it on all platforms. And one of his lectures was about Herzl, who is the founder of Zionism. Today we're going to be speaking about the background, some background on the Zionist movement. We have few episodes coming up in the few weeks that will tackle the subject again with various respected guests. So just as a little intro, basically Zionism is an ideology and a nationalist movement among the Jewish people. It espouses the re-establishment of and support for a Jewish state centered in the area roughly corresponding to the Holy Land, as referenced in the Bible, the region of Palestine. Modern Zionism emerged in the 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe as a national revival movement, both in reaction to newer waves of anti-Semitism and as a response to Haskalah, which is Jewish enlightenment. Soon after this, most leaders of the movement associated the main goal with creating the desired state in Palestine, then an area controlled by the Ottoman Empire. A religious variety of Zionism supports Jews upholding their Jewish identity defined as adherence to religious Judaism, opposes the assimilation of Jews into other societies, and has advocated the return of Jews to Israel as a means for Jews to be a majority nation in their own state. A variety of Zionism called cultural Zionism, founded and represented most prominently by Ahad Ha'im, fostered a secular vision of a Jewish spiritual center in Israel. Unlike Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, Ahad Ha'im strived for Israel to be a Jewish state and not merely a state of Jews. There's various kinds of Zionism. Advocates of Zionism view it as a national liberation movement for the repatriation of persecuted people residing as minorities in a variety of nations to their ancestral homeland. Critics of Zionism view it as a colonialist, racist, and exceptionalist ideology that led advocates to violence during mandatory Palestine, followed by the exodus of Palestinians and the subsequent denial of their rights to return to lands and property lost during the 1948 and 1967 wars, and a continued occupation and a colonial project. So today we'll be tackling the birth and the background of Zionism. And I guess, Professor, before we can talk about Herzl, there were a Zionist movement before Herzl. Isn't that correct?
There were both Jewish and Christian, we would today say evangelical movements. In the United States, 20 years before Herzl wrote his famous essay in 1896, there were what were called prophecy conferences across the Midwest, mostly. And these people they dwelt really on the Bible and the return of the Jews. There are various passages that talk about the return of the Jews. Most Christians think that those passages referred to a return that happened in ancient times, but their interpretation was that it was a prophecy for the future. And these were restorationist movements. So when we see today evangelical support for Israel, that really was 20 years before Herzl. That support was there, and so that's one version. Among Jews, there's a lot of disagreement and different versions, as you mentioned. I thought your summary was very good. There's different versions of exactly what it means to be a Zionist. If you ask Jews today, you do a public opinion poll of Jews and you say, are you a Zionist? a majority will say, no, I'm not. And then, but of those who say, yes, I am, and you ask them, what does that mean that you're a Zionist? They give you so many different answers, Oh, I think there should be a place where Israel can be, where Jews can be safe. Okay, I agree with that. You agree with that. Jews should be safe. What's the problem with that? Others say, well, there should be a Jewish state. Some religious people will say this is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Other religious people will say the Satmars of New York City will say this is a fake Zionist society because the Messiah has to come before you can have a Jewish state. And so Jews are in disagreement. Some want a Jewish state that's simply ethical Judaism, Ha'am, that tradition, that we want. Martin Buber was another very famous person associated with that in the 1930s and 40s. So Jews themselves are not agreed on what this means, and Christians are not agreed on what this means, and it's just it's very hard to make a final definition of what the term Zionism means, because there'll always be someone who will say, well, no, we don't agree with that.
Right. Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, but Zionism as a term, it's derived from the word Zion, which basically refers to Jerusalem in Hebrew. And throughout Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, numerous grassroots groups promoted the national resettlement of the Jews in their homeland, as they called it, as well as the revitalization and cultivation of the Hebrew language. Now, these groups were not the type of Theodor Herzl, because he himself at that time, before 1896 and before 1894 actually, he was more of a person who called for assimilation of the Jews, and he had the idea of the baptism and Christianization of the Jews when he was in Vienna. So he wasn't very much sympathetic with the Zionist movement, not the official, not the political Zionist movement, but the Zionist appeal of many Eastern Jews. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. He was very concerned about Jewish security. I mean, he really was a passionate person. I really admire him for so many reasons. Not only was he a very accomplished writer, a newspaper reporter, he wrote plays and novels. He was a very impressive person, and but he was also passionate about trying to protect the welfare of Jews. And he thought at one point, he actually went and met with the Pope and said, if you'll give me money, he thought the whole problem with why Jews were being abused had to do with religion. And because people said that sometimes. So he thought, well, okay, if we would convert to Christianity, that would end the problem. So he actually went to the Pope and had a meeting with the Pope. He was such a well-connected journalist that he had friends everywhere. So he could contact people and say, could you get me a meeting? And so he said to the Pope, if you'll fund me, I will lead a movement to convert the Jews to Christianity, and we can end the problem of anti-Semitism. Well, not only did the Pope laugh at him after he left, but he later changed his thinking in this. He concluded it was not religion, but it was actually nationality. And as the various national movements, in the late 19th century, all of these small little groups began to want their own country. The Hungarians wanted their own country. The Serbs wanted their own country. Everybody wanted their own little country. The Moldovans, everybody wanted their own little country. The Lithuanians. And he thought, okay, in time, he's a very good analyst. He's a scientist in his way of thinking about history. He says that in time, all of these countries are going to come about, and then the Jews are going to be left out. Right now, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have a government which rules all these different people. That's what an empire is. It rules different countries. And so he said, we can fit right into the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire breaks up and all of these countries emerge, the Jews are going to be squeezed out. We won't have any place to go. So he changed. He thought, okay, we need a place. We need a piece of dirt somewhere in the world. And he didn't really care. He wasn't religious in his thinking. And he didn't really focus on Jerusalem. I mean, for a while, he was happy to do what was called the Uganda scheme, the British said to him, look, we've got this new territory. It's called Uganda, but it's actually what is today Kenya. We've got this territory. We've just taken it over. We don't have anything to do with it. We would like to populate it so we can. The British were always trying to build an empire on the cheap. They wanted to figure out how to make the colonies pay for themselves. So they figured if we put people in, white people in, they can settle this and they can develop it. Herzl thought that was a good idea. He actually went to Kenya and explored the area to see if that was any good. So he's really interesting. His idea of Zionism really varied across time.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to say, but at a certain point in 1896, it's like a bolt of lightning came down and hit him in the head, and he suddenly realized it's not very long until we're going to be squeezed out. And at that point, he wrote this very famous essay called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And he said, he begins by saying, we are a people, one people. The Jews are not just Germans of the Jewish faith, which is the term that was used, or Poles of the Jewish faith, or French of the Jewish faith, or Americans of the Jewish faith. That is not adequate. We are actually all one people. And, you can see this with other people using the same logic. If you're a Palestinian, you will say, in Kuwait, we get mistreated. In Lebanon, we get mistreated. In Jordan, we get mistreated. In Detroit, we get mistreated. Everywhere, it's a different style of mistreatment, but everywhere it has to do with the fact that Palestinians are being mistreated. African Americans say this too, Black people get mistreated wherever they are in the world. Therefore, there is a common identity that we share. And I might say that Osama bin Laden starts his famous declaration of war in the United States. I know you've read this and we've talked about it before, but he starts by making a list of all the places where Muslims are being attacked. And whenever I have students read this, I say, okay, how many of you have even heard of 5 of these places? To us, what's happening in Burma and what's happening in India and what's happening, these are totally separate issues. But if you think in terms of Islamic security, you think, okay, the simple fact is everywhere Muslims they're being mistreated in one way or the other. Therefore, it follows that all Muslims really are one people. And Herzl reached the same conclusion. Wherever we are, we're facing problems. And the simple fact is that we're all Jews. That's it. And we're a people. And we really should recognize that and find a place where we can live. And he says in this famous essay, he says, Jerusalem would be great because we've got all these biblical passages and everybody would be happy if we went to Palestine. But he said we could go somewhere else. We could go to Argentina, he said.
Yes.
Northern Argentina was being developed at that time by the Argentinians. They didn't have enough people in that area. So he said we could go there and settle and develop that area. And in fact, a lot of Jews did go there, and a lot of Palestinians went there too, and Lebanese. Those people saw Argentina as a place to go where there was opportunity. So he was a very flexible man. He was not an ideologue.
Right. So to put things in order, Professor, because this is very important to understanding Herzl and Zionism, because I have a personal feeling that Zionism was evolved very fast, and the death of Herzl early on allowed it to move in any direction at once. And actually, he developed the infrastructure for it to grow in such a way, and it was almost his idea was almost hijacked in a way or another. But getting back to, first of all, I'd like to tell the participants that I will get to your questions by the end of the episode. I promise you that.
I'm eager to hear what the questions are, because I think you and I have talked, but I'm eager to hear what other people have to say as well.
Right. We'll get to them, Doctor, because
very good.
They kind of jump into a more modern time. But Professor, you mentioned Uganda. Uganda was something that was offered in 1903.
Yes.
And he presented it to the Zionist Congress, the Jewish Congress. He presented it. That was the 6th Jewish Congress when he presented it, and he didn't get a good reception for it. Actually, they almost kicked him out from the Congress for that for that idea. Do you think that if Herzl had that offer prior to 1896, when he wrote the Jewish State, do you think that he would have just focused on Uganda?
That's really interesting. Herzl was so secular. He was one of these people. He's like we Christians would say he's an Easter and Christmas Christian. I mean, he was a Yom Kippur Jew. On special holidays he would go with his father to the synagogue, but he was not religious in any way. The Jews of Vienna were not very religious at all, and so he didn't. And the rabbis there were very Western. They were part of Enlightenment rabbis. They were very progressive rabbis. So when he formed the Zionist movement, and it was so well received by religious Jews who thought, oh yeah, here's the coming of the Messiah. We're going to do all of these things that are in the Bible. He held this conference the year after he wrote this. I think, by the way, that was his act of genius. Writing that essay, other people had written similar essays. He not only wrote this essay, which it was brilliantly written, so it was well received, but he realized simply writing something is not going to produce anything. This is a mistake that we make. We think, oh, well, if I got really good arguments, that's going to carry the day. No, it doesn't. You have to have an organization. So the next year, he organized this Basel conference, and he invited everybody who was interested in working on the creation of a Jewish state to come. And when he came in there, he was stunned because there were all of these rabbis from the East, these religious people. I mean, they were all dressed in these dark, rabbinical dress like you might have found in Eastern Europe, but you would never have found in Vienna. I mean, no self-respecting Jew would have dressed like that in Vienna. And so he found all of these people, and he really didn't have much experience. So when he proposed this, they were crying and screaming. There were people tearing their clothes, which is a traditional Jewish sign of mourning, and beating on themselves, to show shame and death and whatever. And I think he was stunned. He was stunned, and he realized I've got to back off fast. So he said, "Oh, well, that was just an idea. I just had a thought. I'm not proposing it." And so he retreated very, very quickly.
Right, Professor. In his Jewish state, Dear Junistat, he says about Palestine. He has a chapter called Palestine or Argentine. He says, "Shall we choose Palestine or Argentine? We shall take what is given us, and what is selected by Jewish public opinion. The society will determine both these points." Proposing Argentine in next to Palestine is almost blasphemous for most of the Zionists of that time and most of the Eastern Jews. But he was totally secular and pragmatic and practical. I love something you said in your podcast. You said Herzl wasn't Zionist; he was territorialist.
That's a good point. Yes,
that's a very strong statement. And I agree with you 100%. But he used the Zionist terminology, and he used the Zionist zeal to push his organization. And you explained it very well in your podcast. To sell Palestine to the Jews is much easier for him to get the project going than selling any other area, although it might be politically more practical to choose other areas. So in 1897, the first Jewish Congress, it chose Palestine and solidified Palestine as the goal. But he was always flexible about it, and the proof of that is 1903, going back and proposing something else.
Yes.
Something else, Professor, in his book, he says, "It goes without saying that we shall respectfully tolerate persons of other faiths and protect their property, their honor, and their freedom with the harshest means of coercion. This is another area in which we shall set the entire world a wonderful example. Should there be many such immovable owners in individual areas," because his plan was to buy areas, "who would not sell their property to us, we shall simply leave them there and develop our commerce in the direction of other areas which belong to us. Now, Zionism didn't do that.
No, well, it didn't work out, did it? Exactly. You start with the ideal, your principles, but when you get down on the ground, other things happen, right? Herzl wasn't thinking of an independent state. He was thinking of an autonomous province within a powerful political system. So the Ottomans controlled the whole of what we would call the Middle East, the Arab world, and he thought, okay, I can have a little province here. And he said to the Ottomans, he said, this is going to actually be good to you because we're going to bring in a lot of money. A lot of wealthy Jews are going to contribute and help us build this state up. We're going to pay taxes to you. It's going to make a lot of money for you, and we're going to be loyal citizens. That's what he was thinking about Argentina too. We'll bring in benefits. We'll come in and we'll bring immigrants in. We'll bring our investments. You hear this all the time when people are talking about immigration to the United States. There are people who are saying, we want people to come in. We want doctors and engineers to come in and investors to come in. Well, we're perfectly happy to have all the Indian or Pakistani doctors and engineers who want to come here, but we don't want the wretched refuse. We got enough poor people. We don't need poor Indians coming in. So he was thinking along that logic. Those governments are going to be really happy to have us. And in fact, the Ottomans, there's another podcast I did on the Ottomans, which people might find as equally interesting, about how the Ottomans saw this. They said, we're really happy to have all of you Jews come in because you people are smart and you got investments, but we do not want you living in Palestine because you're going to create problems for us. So any number of Jews are welcome to come into the Ottoman Empire. You can live anywhere that you want in the whole empire, but you may not live in Palestine. So it was interesting. They were very concerned that this would become a security threat.
Right. Professor, what you said is very important. Herzl was looking for an autonomous province and not an independent state, because in the beginning of the Zionist movement, there were sympathy from the Arab movement at that time. The Arab independence movement had sympathy and had some sort of cooperation and communication with the Zionist movement. And Weizmann has met with Faisal in Aqaba during the Arab revolt, and they had some sort of an understanding because they saw it as a movement for basically to flee persecution that the Jews were facing, and to live with respected rights in an area that they can have participation in its leadership and ruling. And that's something that Arabs didn't see as a threat until the Zionist movement itself changed or revealed its new face, especially after Herzl.
I think that's true. I have a friend whose family is from the Nazareth area, and they're Christians, and they owned a bit of land there, and more than the family needed. And there was a little bit of tension there between Christians and Muslims. So when the Zionists came, they said, could we buy some of your land? You have more than you need. You could invest it, make a business, whatever. So the father thought, this could be good for the area. If there are Jews and if there are Christians and Muslims, that's kind of tense. But if there are Christians, Muslims, and Jews, that's three groups. Maybe it will create a more peaceful dynamic. So he sold some of his land to the Zionists. And later, after 1948, they seized the rest. So it turned out to be a disaster. But this was the logic whereby there were Palestinians who thought, maybe there could be some good benefits to come of this. It wasn't just making money off of the Jews. It was the idea that maybe there would be a new dynamic that would help Jews and Christians and Muslims work together. Of course, it didn't work out that way. But there's a logic. I'm not sure exactly what Faisal's logic was, but he was not entirely hostile.
No, he wasn't, and that hostility did not come through until very later on, or the distrust of the Zionist movement, especially after Balfour Declaration, which was also something that was a shock for the Arab world after Sykes-Picot. Khalid Khatibi asks, lived. Jews live in peace within many Muslim majority countries except for Palestine. Examples can run from Morocco, 10% of the population, to Iran, to others. Why is that the case?
Iraq is really interesting because there was a big Jewish community there, and they were very successful. And the head of the business, Chamber of Commerce or whatever it was called, for a time was Jewish. There was a minister in the cabinet who was Jewish, and they were very successful and had very good connections there. And I think that so much the Zionist movement, I think, changed the dynamic of that whole thing. And so at a certain point, Jews began to be seen as a security threat. After 1948, there was a very strong reaction against Jews, as if they had anything to do with this. If you're sitting in Baghdad, you don't exactly have anything to do with what's happening in Palestine, or if you're sitting in Morocco. But that's not the way the average people saw it, and so it created a really bad situation. It reminds me of Turkey in 1915 during the war. Many Muslims had been driven out of Bulgaria. There had been an uprising, and they got driven out, and were now living in Turkey itself, and they had really bad feelings towards Christians. So when the problem of the Armenians came up, they became very anti-Armenian. You say, wait, the Armenians have nothing at all to do with what happened in Bulgaria. Well, that's not the way people see it. We get our passions and our angers, and we make sweeping generalizations. And you Jews did that, or you Christians did that, or you Muslims did that. And I mean, people have encountered that in our own country. But I think I think the dynamic really changed. 1936 to 39, you mentioned that changed it, because then you had the British aligning themselves with the Jews and the Palestinians being treated very badly. And then after 1948, it just became a catastrophe.
Right. Professor, there's some early apostles of Zionism. They also, another issue, that has entered and influenced Zionism is that many of the early apostles were actually colonialists, and they spoke about that in a very clear format. For example, Zaiv Jabotinsky, one of the considered revisionist Zionists.
Sorry, I missed the name. What is that?
Zaiv Jabotinsky.
Jabotinsky, yes.
Am I
pronouncing it wrong? Jabotinsky, yeah.
Right, and he's the godfather of the political trend that has dominated Israel since 1977.
That's right.
Upheld by Prime Ministers Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, and Benjamin Netanyahu, was especially clear about Zionism having a colonial nature. He wrote in 1923, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." Such honesty was rare among other leading Zionists who, like Herzl, protested the innocent purity of their aims and influenced the Western agenda by not using colonialist terms.
Yes.
Do you think that Herzl had colonialist intentions, but did not sell them that way, or that he had pure intentions from the beginning?
Well, the word colony is it has to be defined. It has different meanings. I have a poster from I have a poster from the early 20th century, a historic poster, which talks about the Jewish Colonization Society. And this is in the tradition of the Romans, who would take part of their population and move them to another place. They didn't necessarily drive people out. Sometimes they did, but you didn't have to do that. Colonization simply meant you were taking some of your people, moving them to another place, and creating a small version of the homeland. So you would follow the same laws and the same language and the same culture. These were colonies. There's a different concept of colonization when the great empires began to colonize and take over other places. And in most places, like in Nigeria, for example, when the British took over Nigeria, they just governed it and exploited it. But they didn't move their population in. But then you get a place like Kenya, where they began moving in white settlers. That created a really different dynamic where basically local people are being pushed off of their land. And it was inevitable that there was going to be a violent uprising against that sooner or later. The Western powers were so powerful that they could get away with this for several decades. But at a certain point, it was going to blow up in your face, as it did in Kenya in the 1950s in the Mau Mau uprising, and as it did in Algeria during the nationalist uprising, and in other places, Iraq and other places. I guess Iraq didn't have a big white population, but in those other places where you moved in white populations. Now Zionism, originally they were just planning to move people there to live. Lord Rothschild, who was very hostile to Herzl and to Zionism as a movement, still had settlements of Jews in Palestine because he had all the Rothschild wines and he needed bottles. So he created a little bottle factory and he moved Jews out. He thought, okay, we're taking poor people who don't have a living. I'll move them out. They can live in they're near what is today called Caesarea, that historic town, and so they created a little Jewish colony there, and they made bottles for his winery. Now that was not conquest. It was a mixture of a humanitarian impulse to help poor people find a place where they could live and control their own affairs. So the whole idea of colonization, it has different meanings. And when it began to have that meaning of conquest, that's when everything changed.
Right. So our understanding of the word colonization is different now than the context it used to be used at that time.
It had a very different meaning, yes.
Right. So not every use of it is similar to what we perceive today. Although for Jabotinsky specifically, I think there's other references that makes it kind of, you lean more towards the meaning of colonization as more of an occupation. For example, he says in another section, he says, Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. And there's other passages, but to save time, so the question of, and Rashid Khalidi, he focuses on that topic within his book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, that he insists that it is a colonial project, and
Yes.
that is continuing till today. Although it might be, a little bit more complicated than that because of all the intricacies. And I feel like with the issue of Zionism, there's a lot of epistemological, problems. The use of words in different contexts in various ways. Any comments about that before we proceed?
No, I haven't read his book, but he was on our campus when he was writing it, and he discussed his main ideas. And I basically think he's right, that there was a colonialist impulse that was there from the very beginning. So the Zionists, you have to, I always tell my students, we have to see things from someone's perspective before we can critique it. Until we can explain it from their point of view, we don't know enough to know if we agree or disagree. those people thought that they wanted to go out there, and their ideology was they would create a working community. They looked at Europe and they said, "Look, so many of these Jews, they don't do physical labor. They're accountants, they're managers, they're doctors, whatever." Of course, in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Russia, there were a lot of working class Jews, but the Zionists were basically in Western Europe. So they said, we basically have an abnormal occupational structure, while other countries, normal countries, have an elite and then a large number of people who are farmers and laborers and whatever. We don't have that. So they said, what we want to do is create a society where every Jew works. And that was the logic of the kibbutz system, whereas everybody would do the same, would cycle around and everybody would wash dishes. You know, Moshe Dayan, the famous military leader, he had to go back to his kibbutz and do dishes because that was his, you know, he had to take his turn. And so that was their ideal. That's honorable. I can see the logic of that, but at the same time, what it did was exclude Palestinians. So as the economy of Palestine was growing statistically, it was only growing for the Jews. The Palestinians were being pushed aside. And so it was both a good thing and a bad thing. Ultimately, the bad sort of, you know, became sort of exploded. So I would say that's a complication of understanding from a positive point of view what the Zionists wanted, but they got something that they didn't necessarily want.
Professor, the State of Israel was established in 1948. The Zionist organization had a Congress last year. It was the 38th Congress of the Zionist Movement. I wonder, why are they still meeting? I mean, they have achieved their goal.
Oh, I didn't know that. They still meet?
Yes.
Isn't that it? I didn't know that. You've taught me something.
They meet right now. They meet like every 5 or 6 years in Jerusalem. So
yes?
It's less frequent, because when I started, they used to meet every year.
What's it called?
It's still called the World Zionist Organization.
The World Zionist Organization. Okay, this is a very interesting thing. At a certain point, the international community agreed. Basically, the whole idea of Zionism is that the Jews are not merely a religious or an ethnic group, people living in temporary exile and then awaiting a return to their homeland. So at a certain point, the world community, that is the big powers, recognized the World Zionist Organization as representing the Jewish people. Now, there's a lot of Jews who got very upset about that. They said, no, look, I'm an American or I'm British or whatever I am. These people don't talk for me. They can talk for themselves. So this organization got recognized internationally under international law. And the Jewish Agency was one of the branches of that Zionist movement that was also recognized. And before Israel became a state, the Jewish Agency was actually the foreign ministry of, it governed the Jewish Yishuv, the Jews who lived actually in Palestine. That was the governing body, the Jewish Agency. And the executive of the Jewish Agency was actually the foreign minister of the Jewish people. That was the Golda Meir had that position for a while. So she was basically the foreign minister of the Jewish people. And still around. They still, I don't know what they do now, because there's a Jewish state. So exactly what they do, I'm not sure.
Yeah, actually, they still exist. Both of them still exist. They're kind of a parallel organization. So they do a lot of things in synchronization together. But I don't know the details of, the inner workings right now. Professor, since we're reaching the end of our time, I wanted to jump into a parallel subject to that, which relates it to the Arab identity. Of course, the issue of Zionism is going to become more important for Arab identity once the colonial project of the British crystallizes and creates the problem in Palestine between the Jews and Arabs, and they create a problem that they couldn't handle, and they had to leave it alone, which we're still suffering from that chaos that they have left. But And some sort of, the Arab identity is kind of, and you've taught Arab-Israeli conflict for a very long time at University of Michigan, and the Arab identity is kind of influenced with that, idealized animosity towards Zionism. Sometimes it is a unifying force for Arabs, and sometimes it is a distracting thing that was used by many Arab politicians to actually distract their people. And that will come later in the program, because we haven't reached to that point yet. We're still in the early century. So in the early century, it seems that the age of nationalism, Arabs were actually inspired by the early Zionist movement, the Herzl movement, and they have also organized in the same streets of Paris that Herzl organized in. And a few in the Sorbonne, they created the Al-Arabi al-Fatat, the Arab Fatat organization. And then they created the first Arab Congress in 1913, which called for also an independent Arab, kind of an autonomous province, the same thing as you're saying, but the independence of the Arab states within the Ottoman Empire, or at least some sort of autonomous, self-rule, and the breaking of the centralization within the Turkish Empire or the Ottoman Empire. They were kind of inspired by each other. The Arab movement was inspired by that general movements that were taking place. I wouldn't say only Herzl, but all the movement that was taking place at that time, the age of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the World War I ended, and Sykes-Picot broke things up, and the Arab Congress never met again.
Yeah.
Do you feel that while the Jewish Congress has achieved the goals it set for itself, the Arab Congress has not really achieved the goals it set for itself? Do you feel that it is an unfinished work?
Oh, that's a good question. I was originally trained as an African specialist. So I read a lot about African history and about the Pan-African movement. And it's interesting that the idea that we are all Africans started in London and Paris. It didn't start back in your own country. So if you take people from Kenya and Nigeria and Zambia and Gold Coast or Ghana, and you drop those people into London, suddenly they all become Africans, because whatever differences they have, it's like being an immigrant, and you come back at home. You're from your hometown, right? And so that the people 5 miles away, they're from a different hometown, right? But when you get in Dearborn, what you realize is that you're all Lebanese, and those differences don't make very much. They fade. So living in a distant place, be it Paris or London or wherever it is, you create an ideology that we are all one people. I think that's pretty much what Herzl did. He saw people. But once you get then back looking at the Arabs, those people come back and they've got this idea, that we're all Arabs. And of course, Nasser loved that idea. That was his key guiding principle, that we're all Arabs. But then you look at practical things. When Egypt and Syria united, the merchants in Aleppo, Halab, began to be very resistant after a little while, because they thought, the Egyptians are taking over everything. We're the ones who are the famous merchants of the Middle East. Aleppo was the most important trade city in the whole Middle East until the Suez Canal went through. And then suddenly, the whole dream of being all on one side, it begins to fall down, because you've got specific grievances at a local level. I think that was inevitable, that you've got this dream that all the Arabs are going to get together and we're going to cooperate and create a good country, which would be a really great idea, I think. but in practice, it's not going to work. So, and of course, you always have outsiders who are quite willing to stir up differences for their own reasons. The last thing that the British wanted was for all the Hashemites to get together. You know, Jordan and Syria and Iraq. They did not want all those people to come together and create a great federation, which is exactly what the Hashemites wanted to do. They wanted to create a Hashemite federation, and so the British did everything they could to stop that. So I think part of this is natural tensions which emerge as local groups realize they don't want other local groups to get an advantage over them, but also outsiders are willing to support one faction or another to get what they want.
Right. I mean, economical tensions, they will grow when there is no good planning and legislation to organize that. And if they were to be, grown somewhere and creating a problem or an obstacle, they should have been an obstacle in the European Union, which has extreme differences in economics between one country and another. That's in addition to the religious, geographical, historical, language, etc., differences. But they have overrode all that with a united identity as the European Union.
Yes.
Don't you think that the Arabs have much easier, obstacle to
well, let's think about the European Union. I think there's a study that was done by American political scientists. He studied federations. When do they come into being? When do countries come together? And when do they break up? And what he discovered was that they came together either when there was a giant power threatening them and they would come together, or when one of them wanted to conquer and would force all the others into federation. So that's how Germany came about. You had all these little German states, but Bismarck wanted to create a giant superstate that would dominate Europe, and so he bludgeoned all the minor states into joining him. The European Union came about when Europe was battered after the war, and they looked to the east and they saw the Soviet Union sitting there with 3 million people in their army. And they thought, oh my goodness, we better get our act together or we're going to be gobbled up one at a time. We can't count on the Americans forever backing us up. And now that the Soviet Union is gone, you see the European Union beginning to fragment and break away because the threat is no longer there. Now, what does this have to do about the Arabs? I don't know. Were the Arabs facing a single threat or were they facing different threats? I know, for example, that the French were very, very upset at the British because they felt that the British got more out of Sykes-Picot than they deserved. So the French were always supporting anybody who was opposing the British. Well, you can see that if you're opposing the British, you might be very happy to have secret French support, but that's not going to be very good about bringing the Arabs together onto one side. And so I think the Arabs really have been fragmented by people being supported by one side or the other. The Americans and the French and the British and the Russians have all given support to one faction or the other, one country or the other, to advance their own cause.
Thank you, Professor. And I'm sure we're going to revisit that topic later on if we were lucky enough to host you again as a guest on this show. Once part 1 is done, part 2 will be more in the second half of the 20th century, where I can't wait till I discuss many of those topics with you. With that, Professor, thank you again for being on this 7th episode of the Arab Identity, discussing the birth and background on Zionism. Thank you, listeners and watchers, followers, and we'll see you in the next episode next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Thank you, Professor.
Good to be here. Bye-bye.